Hi, my name is Sophie Korenfeld, and I'm going to be doing my presentation on sensory receptors in the peripheral nervous system and their links to the central nervous system. The first thing I'm going to discuss is different types of sensory receptors. The first one I'm going to discuss is a mechanoreceptor. Mechanoreceptors are specialized neurons that convert mechanical stimuli into electrical signals. They respond to various forms of mechanical energy, including pressure, vibration, gravity, acceleration, and sound. An example of a mechanoreceptor includes a baroreceptor and an osmoreceptor. Another type of sensory receptor is a thermoreceptor. Thermoreceptors sense neurons that detect changes in temperature. Another example is photoreceptors. Photoreceptors are specialized cells in the retina that detect light and convert it into signals that the brain can use for vision. And finally, the last sensory receptor I'm going to be discussing is a chemoreceptor. Chemoreceptors respond to chemical ligands that bind to the receptor, and they're responsible for taste and smell. A few examples of these include oxygen, pH, and different organic molecules like glucose. The image on the right shows a few examples of sensory receptors in the layers of the skin. I'd like to mention that this is not an exhaustive list of sensory receptors. These are just a few that I decided to mention right now. So the first step is distinguishing stimuli. The body needs to distinguish the stimuli coming from sensory neurons into the brain, because the body will respond differently from chemicals and temperature and light. So the central nervous system uses 4 properties of a stimulus to distinguish between the stimulus. The first property that I'm going to discuss is modality. Modality is indicated by which sensory neurons are activated and the pathways of the activated neurons terminate in the brain. Each receptor type is most sensitive to a particular modality of a stimulus, with each divided into qualities. The brain associates a signal coming from a specific group of receptors with a specific modality, which is known as label line coding. For example, a cold receptor is always perceives something as cold, whether or not it's cold. So that's an example of modality. The next property is location. Location is coded according to which receptive fields are activated. The sensory regions of the cerebrum are associated with respect to incoming signals and input from adjacent sensory receptors that is processed in adjacent regions of the cortex. This arrangement preserves the topographical organization of receptors on the skin, eye, and other regions in the processing centers of the brain. The next property is intensity. The intensity of a stimulus can't be directly calculated from a single sensory neuron. It has to be accumulation of many sensory neurons. Instead, it's either the number of receptors activated, which is known as population coding, or the frequency of action potentials coming from those receptors, which is known as frequency coding. For individual sensory neurons, intensity discrimination begins at the receptor. And once the stimulus intensity exceeds the threshold, the primary sensory neuron begins to fire action potentials. And finally, the last property that I will discuss will be the duration of the stimulus. The duration of the stimulus is coded by the duration of the action potentials in the sensory neuron. So a longer stimulus generates a longer series of action potentials in the primary sensory neuron. So after the stimuli is distinguished, sensory transduction converts the stimuli into graded potentials. Sensory transduction is defined as the conversion of a stimulus to a change in memory potential, which can be processed by the nervous system. Molecules located and localized to the sensory receptor ending are able to generate a receptor potential when an adequate stimulus is applied. The energy in the stimulus, whether it be chemical, physical, or heat, is changed into an electrical response that involve the opening or closing of membrane ion channels. Some sensory transduction mechanisms include signal transduction and second messenger systems that initiate the change in memory potential. Another important thing to mention is that the minimum stimulus required to activate a receptor is known as a threshold. There's also a threshold in terms of action potentials, which is the minimum voltage required to initiate an action potential. In most cases, the channel's opening results in the net influx of sodium and other cations into the receptor, which depolarizes the membrane. Sometimes the response to the stimulus is actually hyperpolarization, which you can see on the graph to the right, which is when the potassium leaves the cell. A change in sensory receptor membrane potential is also known as the graded potential, which can be known as the receptor potential. In some cells, the receptor potential initiates an action potential that travels along the sensory fibers to the central nervous system. In other cells, receptor potentials influence neurotransmitter secretion by the receptor cell, which in turn alters the electrical activity in an associated sensory neuron. So once the stimulus is sent to the central nervous system, then the central nervous system will need to integrate the sensory information. So the sensory information goes from the body to the spinal cord directly to the brain. Some of the sensory information goes directly from the brainstem to the cranial nerves. And then in different parts of the brain, different sensory information is processed. For example, the midbrain receives visual information. The medulla oblongata receives input for sound and taste. And the cerebellum is involved with balance and equilibrium. And then all of these sensory information, other than smell, which was not mentioned, but other than smell, is projected to the thalamus, which acts as a relay and processing station before passing the information onto the cerebrum. For smell, the odor information travels through the nose, through the first cranial nerve and the olfactory bulb to the olfactory cortex in the cerebrum. So the image on the left just shows the different regions where senses are processed in the brain. As you can see, there is slight overlap between the regions, but there's also very distinct areas where the sensory information is being processed. And finally, this is an example of the whole process, an example of just very brief. So it begins with sensation in the peripheral nervous system being sent to the central nervous system. And then it shows how the central nervous system processes the information. And then a response from the brain is sent back to the target tissue. And you can see how the spinal cord plays a role and how the sensory pathway gets projected to the thalamus and then back to the hand. I hope this presentation gives a better idea of the different sensory receptors in the peripheral nervous system and how they interact with the central nervous system. Thank you.